Hello and welcome to our 10-minute review of the brain. Sorry, Pinky can't make it. Now, since this is a very short lecture, I might actually make this about a 15-minute video. So, this is the brain. Towards the front of the brain, I can tell us the front by spinning this way. There's the brainstem, there's a cerebellum in the back, is rostral. Towards the back is caudal. Because in most mammals, the brainstem is coming off this way, going towards the tail. So this side's caudal, this side is rostral. So I might ask you something on the test. The hypothalamus is what compared to the thalamus? So it would be inferior and it's rostral. So we have all of these ridges. These ridges are called gyri. Now, sometimes there's a larger divide called a fissure. So I've actually seen this structure right here as the longitudinal sulcus and the longitudinal fissure. And I try to stay away from that argument as much as possible for this specific one. But generally, if it's a bigger gap, it is a fissure. Now, some of them are very important. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. So the brain has 3 or 4 main parts. This thing up here that you think of as the brain is the cerebrum. It is made up of 5 lobes, which we'll talk about in a second. In the center here is the thalamus, and I don't really have it on this picture where you could see the other lobes of the thalamus. It actually goes in here a little bit. So this is the thalamus. This little bit right here is the mesencephalon, or the midbrain. It gets to be its own specific part. The thalamus has its own embryological origin. The cerebrum has its own embryological origin. The brainstem has its own embryological origin. The mesencephalon, this little 2-inch section, comes by itself. Then we have the brainstem and the cerebellum, and these are sometimes referred to together as the hindbrain. So, the cerebrum. The cerebrum has 5 lobes. This is the frontal lobe right here, and the frontal lobe is separated from the temporal lobe by the longitudinal, whatever they're calling it. I learned fissure. We can call it the sulcus if you really want. And it ends at this sulcus right here, called the central sulcus. Now I'm showing you between the red and the blue. Now this gyrus is actually a very important gyrus. It's the pre-central gyrus, and it is what executes planned motor tasks. What plans them? The premotor cortex right here. Now the parietal lobe is separated from the temporal lobe by the longitudinal fissure, or whatever they're calling it. And it starts at the post-central gyrus, and it goes back here. I've never really seen the parietal occipital lobe or fissure. Excuse me, I was talking with something caught in my throat and words were coming out and I wasn't saying the right word. So the parietal occipital sulcus, it's a sulcus, allegedly is right here. I've never seen it on a real brain. So the parietal lobe, the most important structure on it is this one, the post-central gyrus. Again, the gyruses are the ridges. The sulcus is this cavity between the 2 ridges. Now, this post-central gyrus deals with the general senses, touch and pain and temperature. This is the temporal lobe. It deals with hearing. This is Broca's area. It's only on the left side. It deals with speech. The occipital lobe deals with vision. Now, I'm leaving off smell. Smell is special. It goes everywhere. I'm leaving off taste. Where the heck's taste? Well, remember there's a 5th lobe. Uno, dos, tres, cuatro. The only 4 words I know in Spanish right there. The 5th lobe is hiding in there. So let's turn it around. There it is. It's a little island in there. This is the insular lobe, or the insula. It deals with taste. It deals with some balance. It actually deals with some smell, I think. So, the brain is made up of gray matter and white matter. The gray matter is cell bodies, and they tend to be in the outside part here. So they're in the cortex. And actually, it's why we have this wrinkly bit is that the brain is growing so fast and you're getting all these cell bodies, they fold in on themselves. the white matter's myelinated axons going from point A to point B. So Wernicke's area would be right here. So you'd have a white matter track going from the temporal lobe to Wernicke's area for processing the latest Britney Spears or Taylor Swift song. Now this is an important track. It's the Corpus Callosum. It is a white matter track bridging the right half of the brain to the left half of the brain. So here's a mid-sagittal section. Here we can see the Corpus Callosum right here. That's a white matter track that bridges the left and the right. This is the fornix. It's another white matter track. It's actually going from the habenular nuclei here to something called the limbic system that deals with fear and flight and fight and feeding and another F word that I forget what it is right now. I think fornication or something like that. Okay, so that's another white matter track. We actually have all these white matter tracks in the brainstem that are going up and down. So a track is a myelinated axons going from point A to point B in the central nervous system. We actually have a track right there. That is the interthalamic adhesion. It bridges the two halves of the thalamus, and it's debatable, do we actually use it? It's absent in 20% of people, and there's a study recently that looked at it, and a lot of the fibers actually go into the middle of it and then turn around, so they're wondering, do we actually use it? So, moving on, we have the thalamus. That's the center or middle room right here. That's what thalamus means, by the way. This is a routing station from the brainstem to the different lobes, and it has nuclei for dealing with homeostasis. Now, remember, nuclei is gray matter surrounded by white matter. Now, the hypothalamus is actually doing more of that homeostasis. It has a ton of nuclei, deal with homeostasis, endocrine hormone production, being cold, metabolism, they're all controlled by the hypothalamus. One of my favorite nuclei, it's always M for some reason on the models, the mammillary body. That's another gateway into the limbic system. So the pineal gland's back here. It'll be on your test because of the endocrine system that deals with sleep cycles. You actually have, from the optic chiasm here, a nerve fibers that go here. And they tell you, is it dark, is it light? So we have the midbrain, or mesencephalon. It has the red nuclei and the substantia nigra, so it's really colorful. The red nuclei actually deal with your arms swinging while you walk, so it's not the most important. But the substantia nigra, that is actually what gets destroyed in Parkinson's disease. It's basically a big, gigantic parking brake on movement. It's actually removes the big, gigantic parking brake, I should say, on movement. Then the most important part here is actually the articular formation. It deals with awareness and alertness. So we have the cerebral aqueduct that's taking cerebral spinal fluid from the third ventricle, which would be right here, and to the fourth ventricle. Brainstem, we have nuclei, that's gray matter surrounded by white matter. And the pons has an important respiratory nuclei. In the brainstem, you have nuclei for respiration, heart rate, gagging, breathing. So it's actually very important. This is your fish brain. It deals with basal functions. Now we have the beautiful cerebellum right here, cerebrum, cerebellum, that has this fern-like white matter tracks going through it. And those are called the arbor vitae. You'll also notice the folds are a lot tighter than these gyri, so those are called folia. Somebody was into plants when they named these structures. So we have another nuclei here. I just want to point out that's the olivary body. It looks like an olive on this brain, so I like it there. So that's the brain. Now we also talked about the meninges, which were protective structures of the brain. This model is actually showing the meningeal septa, that is dividing regions of the brain. This was the flux cerebri. This is the Temporium Cerebelli. Think of tent and cerebellum. That's basically how you say it in Latin. And the flux cerebri is down here. So those are divisions of the connective tissue holding the brain to the skull that are separating the regions of the brain. And when it separates it, it makes these dural venous septas that are going to drain cerebral spinal fluid in them. So what is cerebral spinal fluid? Well, we'll talk about that in a second. So here is the skull. There's the sagittal suture. And there is that dural venous sinus that I was talking about that drains the cerebral spinal fluid. So think about it this way. you have your brain here. There's the white matter, there's the gray matter, and we have this connective tissue membrane surrounding it for blood vessels called the pia mater. Then there's these spider webs that are called the Arachnoid Mater, connected to this really thick, tough membrane called the dura mater. Think durable. And that actually holds the brain to the skull. So when you get a hungover, your brain shrinks, this doesn't move, these stretch out. So there's this fluid called cerebrospinal fluid that goes in this space here in the arachnoid mater. And it is going to basically nourish the brain, wash away waste products. And they drain into the dural venous sinus. But what makes this cerebrospinal fluid? Well, remember our brain, here's our corpus callosum, there's our insula. If you look right here, there's a cavity called a ventricle. That's called a lateral ventricle. There's one here, there's one hidden here. And they have a network of blood vessels and epidermal cells called the choroid plexus, and they produce the cerebrospinal fluid. If I were to take the rest of that lobe away, this is what I see. This is the lateral ventricle right here, and its job is to make cerebrospinal fluid. It is going to drain through this interventricular foramen into the third ventricle. Remember that inner thalamic adhesion? There it is. And the third ventricle is right here. See, it actually goes all the way down to the hypothalamus. Cerebral aqueduct, fourth ventricle. And then there's these apertures, lateral and medial. And those are what is going to drain the cerebrospinal fluid into the arachnoid mater. So I'm at 12 minutes now. I told you this 10-minute video would be a little bit long. Make sure you know all the vocabulary words, what happens in what regions of the brain. I'm going to say what is the cerebellum, what happens in the hypothalamus, or what does the limbic system do, or where do you have nuclei that control respiration and breathing and heart rate. So this is probably the hardest lecture just because it's so abstract and you're studying yourself. So good luck, see the study guide,